April 11th, 1951. The White House, Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman sat at his desk, pen in hand. In front of him, a single piece of paper, an order to fire the most famous general in America, General Douglas MacArthur, the man who conquered Japan, the man who saved Korea, the man 60% of Americans wanted to be the next president. Truman's advisors stood around the desk, waiting. "Mr. President," one of them said quietly, "if you sign this, there will be consequences. MacArthur has millions of supporters. The public loves him. Congress will fight you. This could destroy your presidency." Truman looked up. His face was calm. "I know." He signed the paper. One signature. 5 seconds. And the greatest military career in American history was over. Within hours, the news broke. Newspaper headlines screamed across the country. "Truman fires MacArthur." Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming. The nation was in shock. But the real story wasn't the firing. It was what MacArthur said 8 days later, when he stood before Congress and gave a speech so powerful that grown men cried, that senators broke protocol to applaud, that the entire nation stopped to listen.
This is the story of what MacArthur said when the President of the United States ended his career, and how his final words became more legendary than any battle he ever won.
Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments when history turned on a single decision. To understand why Truman fired MacArthur, you need to understand what had been happening in Korea for the past year. June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The war was brutal. Within weeks, North Korea had pushed South Korean and American forces to the very southern tip of the peninsula. They were trapped, surrounded, about to be wiped out. Then MacArthur did something brilliant. Incheon Landing, September 1950. A massive amphibious invasion behind enemy lines. Risky, dangerous. Most military experts said it was impossible. MacArthur did it anyway. It worked. North Korean forces were cut off. The war turned. Within weeks, American and South Korean forces pushed north, liberating Seoul, driving deep into North Korea. MacArthur was a hero. Again. But then China entered the war. November 1950. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the border. They surrounded American forces. The war turned again. American soldiers were retreating in freezing winter conditions. Men were dying. MacArthur wanted to respond with overwhelming force. Bomb Chinese supply lines. Strike military targets inside China. Use every weapon available, including nuclear weapons if necessary. Truman said no. This was the problem. MacArthur didn't just disagree with Truman privately. He disagreed publicly. He gave interviews to newspapers criticizing the president's strategy. He sent letters to Republican congressmen, undermining Truman's policies. In December 1950, Truman issued a direct order. No more public statements without approval. MacArthur ignored it. March 1951. MacArthur issued a public statement threatening China, essentially sabotaging peace negotiations Truman was trying to arrange. Truman had enough. April 5, 1951. Truman met with his top advisors, Secretary of State Dean Axonin, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The question was simple. What do we do about MacArthur? Every single one of them said the same thing. Fire him. Even George Marshall, who had served with MacArthur for decades, who respected him as a military leader, said it. The general has to go. But Truman hesitated. Not because he disagreed. He knew MacArthur had crossed the line. A general doesn't publicly defy the president. That's not how civilian control of the military works. But Truman also knew the cost. MacArthur was more than just popular. He was beloved. Veterans worshipped him. Republicans were already talking about running him for president in 1952. Polls showed MacArthur had higher approval ratings than Truman. If Truman fired him, it would look political. It would look like a president afraid of a rival. Truman didn't care. April 9th. Truman made his final decision. Draft the order. We're relieving MacArthur of command. The plan was to inform MacArthur privately first, then announce it publicly. Give him dignity. Let him retire gracefully. But the press got wind of it. April 11th. Early morning. Reporters started calling the White House asking if the rumors were true. Was MacArthur being fired? Truman's staff panicked. If the press broke the story before MacArthur was officially notified, it would be a disaster. Truman moved fast. He held a press conference at 1 a.m., middle of the night. He announced it himself. I have relieved General MacArthur of his commands and have designated Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway as his successor. The nation woke up to the news. MacArthur found out from the radio. He was in Tokyo. He'd just finished lunch. An aide rushed in. Sir, the radio is saying you've been fired. MacArthur sat down. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Jeannie, we're going home at last. Jeannie was his wife. They'd been overseas for 14 years. Japan, Korea, never back to the United States. Now they were going home, but not quietly. The American public was furious. Truman's approval rating dropped to 22%. Newspapers called the firing a betrayal. Republican senators demanded Truman's impeachment, and then Congress invited MacArthur to speak. April 19, 1951. A joint session of Congress. The House of Representatives and the Senate together. Packed chamber. Every seat filled. Cameras rolling. The entire nation watching. MacArthur walked in. 71 years old. Wearing his military uniform. 4 rows of ribbons. No smile. Just calm dignity. The applause was deafening. He walked to the podium. The room went silent. He began. Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, distinguished members of Congress, I stand on this rostrum with a sense of deep humility and great pride. Humility in the wake of those great American architects of our history who have stood here before me. Pride in the reflection that this forum of legislative debate represents human liberty in the purest form yet devised. His voice was steady, measured, not angry, not bitter. He talked about Korea, about the war, about why he believed his strategy was right. But he didn't attack Truman, not directly. He didn't need to. He talked about duty, about service, about soldiers who fight not for politics but for their country. Then he reached the end. I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all of my boyish hopes and dreams. The chamber was silent. You could hear people breathing. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barracks ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. He paused, and like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. He stepped back from the podium. The room exploded. Applause. Standing ovation. Senators were crying. Grown men, hardened politicians, weeping openly. The applause lasted for minutes. MacArthur stood there, calm, dignified. Then he walked out. He never held a military command again. The next day, newspapers across the country printed the full speech. People read it and cried. Radio stations played recordings of it on repeat. Truman never publicly commented on the speech. Years later, historians asked Truman if he regretted firing MacArthur. No, Truman said. He was insubordinate. I had no choice. The president is commander-in-chief, not the general. That's how it works. But the speech, the historian pressed. MacArthur's farewell speech. Did it affect you? Truman was quiet for a moment. It was a good speech. He always gave a good speech, but speeches don't change the fact that he disobeyed orders. I did what I had to do. MacArthur lived for another 13 years. He never ran for president. He faded away, just like he said he would. But that speech, those final words, became immortal. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Every military officer since then knows those words. They're quoted at retirement ceremonies. They're inscribed on memorials. They've become part of American history. MacArthur lost his command, but he won something bigger. He controlled how his story ended. Truman made the right decision. Firing MacArthur preserved civilian control of the military. It set a precedent that no general, no matter how popular, is above the president. But MacArthur got the last word, And sometimes, the last word is what history remembers. If you were Truman, would you have fired MacArthur? Or would you have let him continue fighting the war his way? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about World War II and the decisions that shaped history, make sure to subscribe.